Welcome to part two.
Yeah.
Yay.
So this is our part two of our waitlist webinar series. And so this is our pre-educational webinar series. And this week's topic is probably it is actually the most asked question by people who are thinking about getting into short-term rentals.
Yeah, and so we all had a lot of you fill out a survey, and we could see the challenges that we were going through. And this is the number one challenge that people were saying is they haven't invested in short-term rentals yet because they just really don't know how to pick a market. And so we wanted to spend some time talking about that.
Yeah, and that's a challenge that we see people get stuck at, and it's a place in somebody's investment journey where if you can't get past that step, you can't do any of the subsequent steps. So for example, getting a real estate agent or finding a property manager or finding a cleaner or all these things that you have to do in order to get started. And it's an absolutely critical step. And if you get stuck there, then you're not going to make that progress.
Yeah, then we see people get stuck there all the time. When we first started actually our journey in real estate investing, we met people who had been stuck at picking a market for years and never taken action. And then every time we've even run Zero to Freedom, which is our course, really, that's our flagship course that covers rentals of all types. We still get people stuck in there. And I know we just had a talk with somebody in Empire Builders who came out of the Zero to Freedom course and was still stuck. So this is a very common thing. So we really want to start out by normalizing it because it's one of those areas that you have to make a decision. And for a lot of people, it feels like a very overwhelming decision because you want all the data and all the facts you can possibly get. But sometimes the facts, they go against each other, or there's different things that you start to weigh, like, is this more important? Is this more important? You get confused, you get overwhelmed. And at that point you stop because you don't know what to do. And so it's very, very common. And the goal of tonight is to try to help you think through. And, ultimately there's not going to be any perfect choice for you, but the most important thing is going to be to take action and choose a market.
Yeah, and then we're going to tell you what happened with that person towards the end, because on the call that we had with her recently, on that call, she made the decision. It was actually really cool to see, and we'll tell you the reason why and what spurred that decision, because it was really cool, and we're going to talk about that today. All right, so this is great. Yeah, people have been coming in, so let's. I think it's time to get started. So let me pull up the presentation that we have prepared for you.
And then just like last time at the end of this presentation, we're happy to answer some questions. So if you want to throw them in the Q&A as they come up for you, go ahead and do that. And we will definitely make time at the end.
Okay. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. All right.
I guess we're going to be small.
I think so. I'm trying to figure out how to, let me just see if I can fix that. Sorry, guys. Just going to try to, there you go. That's what I had to do. And then I need to pin this. That's how you do it. Okay.
Thank goodness for you, because I would not know where to start.
Oh, no. Thank goodness for me, but I'm not able to figure it out. So let me think I know what the issue is. There it is. That's the issue. Okay. There we go.
Yay.
Okay, there we go. Now we're a little bit bigger.
And I do want to say before we even start that a lot of these pictures, these are our short-term rentals or our student short-term rentals. So we wanted to show you actual short-term rentals from our community to make this a real presentation that you can say, you know what, it's possible for me to own something like that. That's really cool.
Yeah, and if you remember from last week, this is the short-term rental that's generating $25,000 to $35,000 a month. That's gross revenue. So
outside of Austin.
Yeah, outside of Austin. All right, so the topic today, as we mentioned, is how to pick a winning short-term rental market. And we always start with our standard disclaimer that we are not financial advisors, we're not legal experts, we're not tax accountants, and this is not to be construed as investment advice. This is purely informational. And so please take that under advisement. Okay. All right. So this is what we're going to cover today. What does a winning short-term rental market look like? Next, we're going to cover the common mistakes to avoid when choosing a market. And then we're going to cover how to choose a winning short-term rental market.
So for those of you who didn't get to attend last week, I'm going to go through a very truncated version of this. Kenji and I started investing together in 2015, and Kenji's been investing long before that. We started with just small multifamily. We didn't have a whole lot of money saved. And over the years, we really built it up, doing a lot of increasing the value of our properties and basically 1031 exchanging them into bigger and bigger properties. We own a range of properties, short-term rentals, long-term rentals in different states. And then we spend a lot of our time teaching physicians and high professionals how to do exactly what we did, which is achieve financial freedom really quickly. We did it in 3 years, and we have students who have now done it much faster than we ever even did. And it's really our joy to be able to share all of this information for you guys and to see the transformations that you achieve when you take this information and just implement it in your life. So again, Kenji went through a ton of challenges. In 2006 was when he actually started investing in short-term rentals. And so he's gone through a lot of real estate experiences through a lot of recessions. And so a lot of what we teach is really risk mitigation. I think of us as pretty risk averse because we're always thinking about the downside and protecting against the downside. So you'll see a lot of that in what we present. We started investing together again in 2015. We were both working full-time as physicians, more than full-time. And we really had this vision of what we wanted for our lives. And that's exactly what we built. And that's what many people in our community come in. The number 1 and 2 things we hear is, I'm working all the time and I want to spend more time with my family and I want to be able to travel. Those are the things that people really want in their lives. They want time freedom and they want financial freedom.
Yeah, I wanted to stress especially given how the economy is right now. And our next webinar is going to talk about investing through a recession. But I wanted to emphasize this point about where we're coming from and the long experience that we have having invested in multiple recessions, especially when it comes to something like short-term rentals. It's really, really important that you think through what could happen in the event of a recession. And there hasn't been a major recession for over 14 years now. So there's not a lot of people out there probably who have invested in short-term rentals even back then. And so what we're teaching is based on my experience investing during downturns, investing in short-term rentals during downturns, because there are some really important and kind of unique things that you need to know in order to successfully navigate those recessions. All right. So before we kind of talk about how to choose a market, we thought it was really important to kind of lay out the different types of markets. And if you look at all the different types of markets that are out there, you can break them down into 4 major categories. And the first one is a rural area. And these are areas where there's not any major attraction. There's not not a big draw. There's not a lot of people visiting that area. And there typically aren't a lot of short-term rentals in those areas, just again, because it's not a destination. The people aren't going there for any particular reason. And so that is a category of short-term rental that actually in some cases, if you're the only short-term rental in that area, you can actually do quite well. Next one is regional vacation. And so these are the vacation areas that are driving distance from major cities. They're not the national destinations where people come from all over the country. These are mostly people who are just coming driving distance, maybe an hour or two. And one of our short-term rentals, for example, is about an hour away from Seattle. And that would be a good example of a regional vacation. It's an area that most people across the country haven't heard of, but people in the Seattle area have heard about.
Yeah. And so wherever you're living, you could probably think of a place if you're in a major city that's a couple hours outside that people will go and they'll have weekend homes. And that's the type of property we're talking about, where people can drive to it. They don't have to jump on a plane and get to it. And so just give you an example, we were in Atlanta for about 10 months. We were living there half time, and everyone was going to the Blue Ridge Mountains right outside of Atlanta. And so people would drive there for the weekend, and then they would come back and work. And that would be an example of like a regional vacation area. It's unlikely you would fly from across country to go to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, some people do it, but it's not a huge majority of people. And that's really in contrast to the national, international vacation markets. Those are places like Orlando, where you would fly across the country to go to that kind of location. And so they're major vacation areas that people tend to go to. There's a lot of argument about which is better, national, regional vacation or national vacation. There are upsides and downsides of every single market we're going to talk about, but we can definitely go into more detail if people have questions about like which market's better and things like that.
All right. And then the last category is metro urban. And this is an example of our short-term rental in a urban area. And the reason why metro urban areas, we can talk about some of these upsides, downsides, but really briefly, one of the big draws for metro and urban areas is that you're going to have people coming all year round. It's not going to be seasonal like some of these regional vacation areas. The national ones tend to have less seasonality to it because people are going there all year. But metro urban areas are really insulated from that because there's going to be lots of things going on in the city, lots of reasons why people would go to a city, lots of reasons why people need a place to stay.
But thinking through the short-term rental regulations, the more difficult places tend to be the metro urban areas, because a lot of times there's movements towards banning short-term rentals if there are issues with affordable housing. And so even in our short-term rental in Dallas, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in Dallas, which you would never think there would be issues, very red state. But these short-term rental regulations are becoming more of a discussion point for local government. So there are downsides and upsides of every single one of these markets. And so you really have to think there's no right market, we're just going to put that out there for these types, but you really have to think about the upsides and downsides and think about what you value.
Yeah. And those upsides and downsides, when we say that, we were talking about how we think about risk, we think about how to mitigate risk. And this is one of the tools that we use, thinking through the upsides and downsides. Most people can easily think about the upsides, but very few think about very thoroughly and deeply about the downsides. And that's a really, really important part of mitigating risk. All right, so let's dive into what does a winning market look like? And so I think number one, Leti,
it's always number one.
Yeah, already talked about the risk of restrictions. Ultimately, if you have restrictions on short-term rentals, you can't even operate your business. So it has to be the number one issue that you need to kind of consider. And so a winning market is one that has very low risk of new regulations coming up, very restrictive regulations. And those are pretty easy to spot. Those are the ones that tend to have already have like permitting processes, or they are already collecting a considerable amount of taxes. And so what people like to say is that the city is already addicted to that revenue that they're getting from those short-term rental permits or short-term rental short-term rental regulation income. Yeah. And so and go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just want to clarify because I don't think that was really clear. When you have those regulations in place already and the city's already making money off of those, then it makes it a little bit less likely that the city's completely going to ban short-term rentals. But you definitely want to keep an eye out for how the sentiment is going in your market. And so you can have a market that's very traditionally tolerant of short-term rentals that can change over time. The other thing you want to think about is this a market that is really well established with people staying in houses and Airbnbs, for example, because what can be concerning and what can happen is the hotel lobbies can be very, very strong in certain places. And so if you have a place that's got a ton of hotels and Airbnbs haven't been around for a long, long time, and all of a sudden people are getting more short-term rentals, that hotel lobby can be quite forceful. And so we've seen in places like Hawaii, for example, that, you know, people renting short-term rentals all over Oahu, and then the hotel lobby has become stronger over time and taken more action. And now you're really regulated to a very small area of Oahu that you can even have short-term rentals. And so you really want to follow the sentiment. You want obviously a place that ideally has some regulations in place, is somewhat addicted to the income, but isn't moving towards really like negative sentiment in the market. And not always can you predict where it's going to be in 5 years. So this is a little bit of an additional risk that you're taking on with your properties when you're getting a short-term rental. But again, looking at patterns and saying, has it been this way that most people stay in short-term rentals? Has it been this way for 10 years? And is it very likely that it's going to continue this way because there aren't a whole lot of hotels? That will give you a little bit more security, but it's never going to be 100%.
With that said, I will say that if you can acquire a property that has a permit and those permits are very limited, then you can actually do really well, right? Just because they're regulating the competition, they're restricting new permits and they're restricting the competition from coming in. So that could be a really good situation. Or if you are earlier in a market and you get a permit and there's talk about restricting future permits, that can also be a nice situation. So it doesn't mean that, you know, you absolutely have to avoid any place that has permitting or regulations or whatnot. You can sometimes take advantage of it as well. So just kind of think about those kinds of things. Think about it from different aspects. You also want to find areas where there's growth, and this may not be the typical growth. It may not be population growth, but it could be more growth in terms of people vacationing in that area, right? It could be new attractions that are going to draw people to that area. So growth doesn't necessarily mean local population growth, because local population growth actually may lead to more restrictions. And so when we're talking about growth, you really want to think about it in terms of more guests coming into an area. You also want lower property prices, because ultimately, you know, if you think about, let's say $1 million short-term rental, and you just do the numbers, and once you start doing the cash on cash return calculations, you get an idea of how much revenue you have to generate in order to cover $1 million mortgage. But if you have $1 million rental, then, you know, just to kind of give you a ballpark, you're going to want to make sure you're grossing $125,000 or $150,000.
Probably more.
Probably more.
Really
Yeah, probably more. That's just like a minimum. And so the higher the price, right, the more you're going to have to generate in terms of revenue. And that means higher nightly rates and higher occupancy rates. And so now if you have a lower price point and you're able to command, you know, decent nightly rates and good occupancy, then it's much easier for you to be able to pay all those expenses that short-term rentals generate.
Another thing about price point is, you know, a lot of us have a certain amount of income that we start out with, or a certain amount of savings when we start out investing. And one of the great things about short-term rentals is you can put 10% down, but you can imagine if you're buying a $2 million property versus buying, you know, several $250,000 or $300,000 properties, your money is going to go a lot farther with those smaller properties. And so that's another thing to consider is just the spreading your money, because that does reduce your concentration risk. If all you own in your portfolio is one property, that is the highest concentration risk that you have. It's once you get to our stage where you own lots of properties, now you have much lower concentration risk. And if something happens to one or two properties, it's not a big deal because all your other properties are bringing cash flow. But when you only have one and something happens to that property, it is a really big deal.
Next one is you want something that can cash flow well. And cash flow is absolutely essential. And I can tell you from my experience investing back in 2006 with my first furnished rental. Back then it wasn't called short-term rentals, they were called furnished rentals. My property when the recession started, and it was much harder to find tenants. I was not cash flowing on my property. And so what you want to do is you really want to make sure you're cash flowing, because when you're not cash flowing, that means that all of a sudden you now have a new boss. Your new boss is your short-term rental, who commands that you go out and do extra shifts in order to be able to pay the mortgage, utilities, and all those expenses associated with the short-term rental. And so you want to make sure that whatever you buy is going to cash flow, and you want to pressure test that, right? You want to say, okay, what happens if some of the expenses go up, or if my income comes down, right?
Yeah, and the fact is there are some markets that it's easier to cash flow in. And there are some markets that it's a little bit more difficult. And it's not to say that you can't go to an area that's a little bit more challenging to find cash flow and find cash flow. You will still be able to do that. You will have to be very creative, and you're going to have to be thinking about how to differentiate your property. So it's not saying that it's impossible to do, but there will be areas that are easier to cash flow, and there are going to be places that are a little bit more challenging.
And then another really important factor that a lot of people kind of miss this one is having the necessary team members available. So you want to make sure you have a place where you can easily find cleaners or handymen, because these are the people that are going to help make sure that your property runs really well. Cleaning is such an important factor, probably under-recognized for people who haven't started yet. It's one of the most important factors is cleanliness. And so, for example, we have a property that's in a pretty remote area, and there's a couple property managers in that area who have really kind of identified all the different cleaners in the area and kind of locked them into different contracts. And so, very hard to find a cleaner. And if we're going to get a cleaner in that area, that person's got to drive, probably about 30-40 minutes in order to get to our property. And so that's really restrictive. And so you really want to make sure you think about, are the team members that you need to run your property well, are they available?
And are there a lot of choices
Yeah. And
if they do have them available?
Yeah, and I want to talk about this picture. This is a student's property, and she was actually able to buy this short-term rental with no money down. And if you want to check out this past week's article, I actually talk about this property, and you can find out how she was able to buy this property with no money down and cash flowing really well on it. And she actually forced a lot of appreciation by adding an extra bedroom. That story is all laid out in this week's article. Patricia, I don't know if you can go to the blog and maybe pull that article and share that link with everyone. I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in hearing about it. And this picture is also another picture from that same short-term rental. All right, well, so the last slide we were talking about, what does a winning market look like in general, but what does a winning market look like for you? And that's what we're going to talk about here. And so the first one is, you want to find a place where there are multiple different locations in the area where you can invest. It's not just restricted to one small area. There's a lot of different options, because the more options you have, the easier it is going to be to find a good property. Maybe there's multiple destinations in an area, so you can choose. If you just had one destination, everybody's going to crowd around that one area, right? But if you have multiple destinations, then the likelihood of you being able to find something in a still really good location is very good. Another one is plenty of opportunities for forced appreciation. For those of you who don't know what forced appreciation is, it's what the student did is that she bought 1,000 square foot, one bedroom. And if you know about square footage and number of bedrooms, if you have 1,000 square feet, you should definitely be able to find room for a second bedroom. And sure enough, she was able to find a really easy space. All she had to do was put up a wall. That putting up a wall cost maybe a couple $1,000s max, but she was able to increase the value of the property by over 100,000 just by putting up a wall, right? A wall and a door. And so by adding extra bedrooms, right, you can actually force that value of the property to go up, because the property is no longer a one bedroom, right? It's a two bedroom now. And so now when appraisers go out and compare the value of that property to other two bedrooms, naturally it's going to be a higher value, and that's how you force appreciation. That's just one example, but there are lots of ways to force appreciation. But what you want to do is you want to find an area or that has properties that has plenty of opportunities to force appreciation. And I can give you an example of a market, 30A Watercolor, for example, right? Beautiful short-term rentals, but highly regulated in terms of what you can do with the property. You can't even paint the property without getting approval from the HOA, for example, right? And so that's an example of highly restrictive HOA that controls what you can and can't do, and that really limits your ability to, let's say, add an addition or maybe make some major interior improvements to add multiple bedrooms. So that's, again, I'm not saying that that's a bad market. I'm just saying that I wanted to illustrate to you where that's a market that's going to probably have fewer opportunities for forced appreciation than another market where they don't have the same restrictions.
Yeah, I think the other places that you would probably have fewer opportunities. And again, there's often opportunity if you just look in the right places. I mean, even in this example, it's not like this property, was falling apart or anything like that. She just was able to see that there was some space that she could add an extra bedroom. And oftentimes you can do that in even new builds. But I would say in general, the places with all new builds is going to be a little bit more difficult to force that appreciation. But again, still not even impossible, because we have a student who actually bought a new build right before they finished it and was able to make interior upgrades and negotiate that as part of her purchase, and also add a pool, and forced a ton of appreciation to that property. So there are generalizations, but there's no hard and fast rule. And we never say anything's impossible, because when you are creative and when you're looking for opportunities, a lot of times you find them where a lot of people are missing them.
Another aspect of a winning market is that you want to be able to establish a competitive advantage. And so what you want to do is you want to look at a market and say, what's missing here? Where's a gap? An example of a gap is, if you have a lot of hotels, right? Hotels are going to have typically a room. Maybe there might be a 2-bedroom hotel room, maybe. But so those 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, you're going to have a lot of competition there. But maybe the 3 bedrooms or 4 bedrooms, right? There's maybe not a lot of inventory there, and you find a gap in the market. You find that there's opportunity here where there's pretty much not a lot of inventory for that type of property. In the Dallas market, an example is that there aren't many houses with pools on Airbnb, right? And so that was one of the reasons why we decided that we definitely wanted to have a pool so that we can establish a clear competitive advantage.
Another one is if you have an excellent team who can help you both win deals and then operate your deals very, very well. Oftentimes, one of the biggest challenges is your team, your boots on the ground, your cleaner, your handyman, and having them be very good and be able to deliver the high quality of care and cleaning that you want. And then same with your agents. If you have really stellar agents or really stellar contractors, they're going to give you an advantage over everybody else, because you're going to be able to get those deals at a discount if they're seeing them first, and they're able to bring you off market deals, and they're able to negotiate really, really well. And so if you make money in the very beginning when you buy that property, and you have a great team that helps you run that property efficiently, you're going to do well, even if your property is the same as a property next door. If you have a better team, it's going to make a huge, huge difference.
Another factor is that if a market adds to your portfolio diversification. So let's say that you have a couple short-term rentals and this new market is in a different area, right? And so if you have all your short-term rentals in one area compared to multiple short-term rentals in different markets, you're not going to be as exposed if something happens that one area, like say some natural disaster. And so if you have it's like placing your bets in a lot of different markets. It's an example of portfolio diversification.
Yeah. So if you have one market and then you're like looking for that second winning market, you really might think strongly about going to a different market, even though you have the efficiencies in the first one, just to give yourself a little bit more portfolio diversification, so that you can make it through the tougher times, or make it through a natural disaster that hits one area and doesn't affect your other. And we even think about this in long-term rentals as well. We think about the same concepts and spreading our bets across different markets.
And this last one allows for a backup plan. I mean, this is exactly the type of thinking that you need to have going into a recession, right? This is what I didn't have back in 2006. I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have a way to exit those properties I literally had to wait it out until the recession was over, until the market started turning. And it wasn't until then that I was actually able to sell. And I didn't sell for a profit because ultimately I needed to wait actually several more years before the market really had that upswing before I could actually make money on it. And so this is where you want to make sure you have a backup plan, a way to exit a deal if something doesn't go right, or let's say if there's a short-term rental regulation.
Yeah, and Kenji's alluded to this too, that if you have a property that's cash flowing, that's incredibly important. That's, why we put it in the slide before. That cash flow is what allows you to not need the backup plan, because if your property is performing really well, then and it continues to perform very well, and you were prepared for a little bit of drop, let's say in revenue, because it's in a vacation area and you knew you were going into a recession, then you're not going to need that backup plan of trying to sell the property or trying to make it a long-term rental. And that's really the goal. But even if that's the goal, you still need to think about the backup plan and still at least have it in your minds. And so, for example, our property that's kind of in a regional, but really more like a rural place. Our backup plan was like, okay, well, first of all, we're going to really force appreciation here so we can sell it if we need to. So if short-term rental regulations change, or it's not doing very well, we'll always have that opportunity to sell it and make a profit because we force that appreciation. But then we also said, well, if we really have to, we'll move into it and make it a primary residence. It's in an area of the country we really love. And that was our backup plan. Those were our two backup plans. But ideally, you have a backup plan where it actually works as a long-term rental, because that is the ultimate backup plan. And we have a lot of people in our community who buy, duplexes, and they're making them into short-term rentals, but they have that ultimate backup plan that if they needed to, they could turn it into a midterm rental or a long-term rental, and they're still going to cash flow.
Right. And that brings up a really good point, right? Is that most people, when they think about vacation rentals, they're thinking about a house in a vacation area. And, one of the ways that you can have I would say it's a winning strategy when it comes to short-term rentals, is to think differently from everybody else. Is not to buy a vacation rental, but buy a long-term rental that could be used as a midterm rental or short-term rental, right? Because your fallback option is just turn it back into a long-term rental and it'll do fine. And so that's the reason why. That's one way. Again, we're not talking about markets now, we're talking about a winning strategy. But if you can apply that winning strategy in a winning market, then you can do really well. All right, so let's now shift to talking about some common mistakes to avoid when choosing a market. And we talked about this earlier about choosing a market that already has that negative sentiment against it. And you can just tell that things are headed for more regulations. And I'll tell you that there have been a number of situations with students where they even talked to the city council, and the city council was saying, no, we're going to lift the ban. There was a temporary ban during COVID. We're going to lift it. And they were reassured by them or assured by them that don't worry, you're going to be able to get a permit. Turns out that the city council, soon after they bought their short-term rental, decided to make that ban permanent. And so, again, what you don't want to do is you don't want to be in a market where there's just a lot of negative talk, a lot of people in the community that are unhappy about the short-term rentals, people owning short-term rentals. And so that's something that you really want to look for.
Now, one question we do sometimes see in our community is like, well, I know that, this is kind of illegal to have this short-term rental, but there's so many people doing it around here. What if I just do it? And, is it okay to buy this property and then do what everyone else is doing? The thing is, you're taking on a lot of risk if you do that, because you don't know how things are going to change. And if there's already that negative sentiment and there's already regulations against short-term rentals, just because people are getting away with it right now doesn't mean they're going to be getting away with it in a year or two. And so just to bring up Hawaii again, the regulations, of course, against short-term rentals radically changed in Oahu, but then they increased the fees that you have to pay if you get caught having an illegal short-term rental. And so we were chatting with some of our Hawaii investors, and they were saying that they could get fined up to $10,000 a day if they were caught with an illegal Airbnb. So just because things are a certain way right now does not mean it's going to be there in 2 or 3 years. And you don't want to buy a property assuming it's going to stay the same, but knowing that it's illegal, because you are taking a ton of risk. So just make sure that you really think hard before you do that kind of thing.
Another mistake is choosing a market mainly because it's close to where you live or where you want to vacation. And so what we're talking about here is that you're over making money, you're prioritizing or optimizing for some personal benefit, right? And it doesn't mean that for some people, they don't have a market close by that is a great market. That's not what we're talking about. What we're just saying is that your tunnel vision to choosing only markets that are, let's say, driving distance or it's a place that you want a vacation. But when you look at it objectively, it's not an ideal market, and it's not going to be one of these markets that, like we talked about, some of the winning characteristics of the markets that we were just talking about.
Yeah, and one of the keys here is you got to make sure that the choices you make in real estate are really aligned with your goals. And so if you tell us, hey, my goal is to get to 200,000 in cash flow in less than 2 years, and I'm going to do this because I'm going to get to financial freedom, your decisions need to be a certain way. If you then say, well, actually, I really want a second home, and there's this really great market 30 minutes away where I know it's really hard to get cash in cash, so maybe I'll just be cash flow neutral and it's going to be okay because I can use it. That's not really consistent with what you're telling us your goal is. So think about your goal first. And if your goal is just to get a second home, then you're making a decision that's completely congruent with that. That's cool. And I want to tell you that, that rural cabin that we bought, was it the best short-term rental out there? No, not at all. We bought it knowing that we had a huge portfolio of properties, and we were going in thinking our cash and cash was going to be maybe 12 to 14%, which is not ideal for a long-term rental. Really, in our community, short-term rental. In our community, people are aiming for closer to 20% cash and cash, even including the property management. And so that 12 to 14%, we knew it wasn't a home run, but we were willing to accept that because of the stage in our portfolio, and it was consistent with what we wanted, which was we wanted an opportunity to have a place to go away with our family. It was during COVID, and we were willing to accept a little bit lower cash and cash across our portfolio. So this is not always to say that you're going to make only the financial decisions. Sometimes your emotions will weigh into it, but it's really got to be consistent with your goal. And if your goal is to fast fire, if your goal is to get to financial freedom as soon as possible while you're young enough to enjoy it, and you're just starting out, this is not consistent with that goal.
Another common mistake is when people choose these popular destination markets without a clear plan for how they're going to stand out. So sure, Orlando, great vacation rental market, but it is saturated. There's a lot of competition, and if you don't have a clear plan for how you're going to stand out, then you are probably going to get crushed by the competition.
And this is why people will make the argument that regional vacation markets are actually better than large vacation markets, because there'll likely be less competition in those regional ones. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is that even those places have gotten quite competitive. And what you really don't want to be is a mom and pop landlord. And you don't want to do that with long-term rentals either. You want to be a real professional. You want to treat this like a business. You want to take it seriously. You want to be constantly marketing and innovating and making your properties better. And it doesn't matter really what market you're in. You're going to have to step it up compared to what people had to do 5 years ago when there was just really not that much competition.
And then this last one, choosing a market, hoping that it will emerge. And so this is one of those situations where they're talking about having some great destination, and you go, okay, I'm ahead of the curve here. I'm going to buy this property, and it's things are just going to take off. But then that whatever plan they had in place just never happens, right? And we see this all the time. And I'll admit it, for a long-term rental, we even did the same thing. We were like, oh, they have this light rail that's coming in. It's going to be amazing. But at the end of the day, it's going to take actually probably another couple of decades before that area is really going to completely turn around. And the light rail alone is not going to be the reason why it's going to turn around. So that's just an example where it can take time for these things to turn around. And so just want to make sure that you aren't choosing these markets hoping that something's going to happen that's going to lead to that place becoming a major destination.
So Kenji and I have had the opportunity to go listen to Bill Gross, who is a billionaire. He's created $7 billion companies. And one of the things he says is, you want to be an early person into the space, but you don't want to be the first person. He always says that, because if you're the first person, you're so far ahead of your time that nobody gets you and everyone thinks you're crazy. And it's only once a few people do it and they're successful that then you know it's actually going to work. And if you're the first person, he says you have lots of arrows in your back. And so you want to be an early adopter, but you don't want to be one of the first few adopters. That's the idea behind this one.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about how to choose a winning short-term rental market. And we broke it down into just 3 things, and we're going to cover each of these one by one. So the first one is be clear about how short-term rentals fit into your long-term goals, and we'll talk more about that. Next is you want to triangulate data. You want to get multiple pieces of data to help inform your decision. You don't want to just base it off of one thing. And then the third thing is you have to realize at the end of the day that execution can be more important than market choice. In other words, you can probably make most markets work, even rural areas, even the national vacation rental markets.
As long as there's no short-term rental ban.
Right, exactly.
Anywhere.
Right.
You can probably make that one work.
Yeah, you can probably make pretty much any market work as long as you execute well. And we'll talk about that as well. So let's talk about the first one. So be clear about your long-term goals. And what does that mean? So we talked earlier about distinguishing when you're thinking about a market, distinguishing between, is this an emotional decision? Is this based on something that you desire? Is this because, it's a place that you want to go with your family, or does it fit into your long-term goals?
If you optimize even a little for personal use, we already discussed this, you can choose a suboptimal market because you're really limiting your options right away because you want to use it. And you're not looking at all the options around you, and you're not actually looking for cash flow or short-term rental regulations. You're not looking at those important pieces that are a sign of a good investment. You're choosing that emotional pull for yourself to be able to use it. So especially if your goal is to get fast fire, that doesn't make sense. Later on in your portfolio, when you have this excess capital coming in from all your rental properties, that's when you get that freedom to be able to make those decisions that aren't economic anymore. They're really emotional.
This next one we see actually very often, which is that people, when they're buying short-term rentals, they're trying to optimize for taxes. And for those of you who don't know, you can use a short-term rental to shelter your income. So if you have W-2 or 1099 income, as long as you do the required number of hours, operating and setting up and operating your short-term rental, you can shelter your W-2 or 1099 income. And so if you didn't know that,
we can throw an article in.
Maybe we can certainly talk
tax
about
benefits. Of
maybe
rentals.
Patricia can toss in. Yeah, it's called the tax benefits of short-term rentals. And so what we see is that we see people optimizing for taxes, and the way that this works is that the more expensive property you buy, the more you can shelter in terms of income. And so if you have a high income, then you're going to need to buy really expensive short-term rentals.
Or spend a lot of money on a lot of short-term rentals.
Yeah,
that's the other way you can do it.
Yeah, that's right. But the problem with that is that if you're driven by that, it may actually lead you to buy in an overpriced market, or maybe you overpay for property in maybe it's the right market, but you overpay for a property. And so we have seen this happen. And if you, again, you want to make sure that you are focus on the most important things. Taxes are important, right? We're not saying it's not important, but we think of them as secondary. Actually, we think cash flow is number one, and forced appreciation. Those two are the most important, and then taxes are a secondary benefit.
And then lastly, if your choice is driven by fear, then it can also lead you to choose a suboptimal market. I want to normalize this because I think whenever we try something new, we get fear. And the idea of going out and trying something new and buying a short-term rental and then buying it in a market that's long distance from you just scares people so much when they first start to think about it. But what that leads people to do is trying to make their local market work. And it's not an optimal market. Maybe there's short-term rental regulations, or maybe making cash flow is extremely difficult because of the taxes or for whatever reason. And they're stuck trying to make that market work. And there just aren't as many cash flowing opportunities, and it slows down their progress. And they might even give up, all because they were so driven by fear that they just chose what felt most safe to them. And so you really, again, want to choose that ultimate goal and let that guide what you do. And so if your ultimate goal is to get to 200,000 in cash flow in 2 years, then you say, well, where can I get the best cash flowing properties? That's the next question that comes out of it. It's not, how can I use my property down the road and make 200,000, right? It's like, where can I get the best property that makes the most money? Now, I want to point out that this is one of our students' designs, and she just really sets the properties apart with her designs. You know, you're not even seeing what the outside looks like, but this is just head and shoulders above what a lot of people do with their short-term rental designs. And you can see that, again, if you had two exact same properties side by side, and she's got this, and the other person has what a lot of mom and pops do with their short-term rental decorations, she's going to get way more bookings. And it isn't even dependent on, I mean, two exact same properties. You can set yourself apart substantially with your design.
Yeah, and we also chose this picture because, you know, it kind of speaks to the point of focusing on that long-term goal, right? She's focused on, you know, having that wow factor, standing out, and she's catering to the guest. She may not want to design her house in this way, like, you know, or you may not choose to design your house in this way. But what she did was she really wanted to stand out. She wanted the place to pop. She knew what her guests liked, and that's how she designed it. She designed it for the guest, not for herself. And so again, that's an example of how, you know, she's spending thousands and thousands of dollars on all the stuff that she would never buy for herself if it was her own house, but she's doing it because she knows that this is what the guests want.
And in this particular example, she's taken properties that were previous short-term rentals and not changed a lot in the actual structure of the house, but literally just gone in and painted and made them look much more beautiful, got new furniture, did this design, and has totally changed the income and profit of those properties. And so with short-term rentals, you have that ability to do that without making major structural changes, which is not something you have when you're doing a long-term rental where people are bringing in their own furniture and everything. So it's kind of a unique aspect of short-term rentals.
All right. And let's talk about this next topic. We were saying, what does it mean to triangulate? So we were saying that triangulation is one of the ways that you can narrow down and pick a market. And so what triangulation means is that you are evaluating multiple sources to help narrow down your choice. And this can be a combination of a lot of different things. And so, and this is not a complete list, but this is, you know, just compiled a couple thoughts, a couple ideas for what sources that you can draw from. First one is really your personal expertise. If you have an expertise or an experience in a particular area, location, destination that, you know, either you've been to or you know people who have been to, it's maybe close to family and friends. So therefore you have some additional expertise or experience. This can be an important factor. Shouldn't be the only factor, right? But it can be an important factor to help inform your choice.
And I'll give you an example of that. You know, like 30A, for example, is down in the Florida Panhandle area. It's very close to Atlanta. And so when we were living in Atlanta, Kenji's best friend was down investing in 30A. And so to have him down there with the entire team and have him have all that expertise, it would have been very easy, much easier for us to jump on what he was doing with his great team and be able to source really great deals and improve them with his contracting team, rather than going out and starting finding a new market and putting all those pieces in place. So sometimes it is easiest to piggyback on people who are already having success, who you know in that area.
Yeah, given what happened, we probably should have bought back then. Next one is there are a lot of data sources out there. There's AirDNA, Mashvisor. There's a lot of short-term rental rankings that are based on a lot of different factors. There are also some raw data sources where you can look at, population trends and economic trends. And so data sources are good, but again, you don't want to rely just on a data source, right? You want to triangulate, you want to get multiple sources of information.
I think the challenge that people do run into, though, if they're so data driven, is they start to get overwhelmed because they're like, oh, well, I got this piece of data and it makes sense and I want to go with this market. But then I found this other piece of data that doesn't make me feel good about this market. And you can have multiple pieces of data that are telling you different things, and it can feel really confusing and people can feel overwhelmed, and then they don't know how much weighting to give to each piece of data. How much weighting should I get towards the short-term rental kind of negative sentiment that people have been seeing versus, people are cash flowing a ton. Like, what do I do? And it can get a little bit confusing. And so ultimately, sometimes you just have to know that you're not going to know with 100% certainty, but you're ultimately just going to have to make a decision. So go out and get the data and do the best you can to kind of filter through all of it, but don't get to the point that you're so overwhelmed you don't take any action at all.
You also want to take into account seasonality. That's really important. We talked about that earlier, and also major events. I mean, there are certain events where some people will make their entire year's mortgage payment in a couple of weeks of a year during a major event, just because, again, it's a combination of limited inventory, major event, and you can just charge an extremely high average daily rate and do really well during those times. So that could be something to consider.
For example, Coachella, I know, is a big one for people in Palm Springs, and it can bring in so much income. And it's something that repeats every single year and unlikely to move. It's been there for a long time. Obviously, that's always a risk, but that's one of those things that people will build their numbers. They'll put in their numbers, Coachella, I know this is what I'm going to be able to make. And then that increases the average that they're going to make a daily rate over the course of the year. I also want to point out seasonality. This is really important. It can be very challenging to make a lot of cash flow in places that only have one season. So you may want, when you're looking, just think about maybe having at least 2 seasons where people will come. I think about our more rural location. We have a lot of people who are hiking and climbing and doing like water rafting in the summer, but then we also have the skiers in the winter, and that allows us to stay more full and have other sources of income coming in year round, rather than a beach place like when I was looking in the San Juan Islands, it's only a summer place. Like, there's no winter activities, and so it was very much more difficult to cash flow in a place like that.
And this next one is, I think, really underrated, probably under-recognized, which is getting input from successful short-term rental owners. And I mean, just imagine, you can look at AirDNA, right? But what is that data based on? It's based on combing, Airbnb and looking at what people are charging. It doesn't necessarily inform what they're actually doing, like how much they're actually making, what the true occupancy is. Did they give a discount, right? All these different factors aren't incorporated in the data. But if you can actually hear from somebody and hear their success, get actual numbers from them, then that is the best data point compared to an AirDNA or any of these types of data sources. If you get the actual data from somebody from their actual performance.
Yeah, the idea is success leaves clues.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can find somebody who's having success in that market and just model them, you're much more likely to be successful.
Yeah, and this is where community is absolutely essential. So, I don't know if you're kind of a lone wolf type investor. When we started investing, we didn't have a community at all, but now we have this great community. And in our community, Leti mentioned Empire Builders is our membership site. It's where people go after they take our courses, and in that community, we have people who have over 400 short-term rentals in that community. That was our last count, and that's still growing on a daily basis, literally, where people are buying short-term rentals all the time. And so that is a huge data set, and that's a community where you can literally find somebody who is probably investing in an area you're thinking about, and they can give you that actual data. And so again, the idea here is to combine all that information. You don't just kind of go, oh, this guy was successful with short-term rentals, I should invest there. You want to verify, right? You want to go out and look at the data. You also want to take into account, the seasonality, understand all the different major events, right? You want to again triangulate that information in order to help you narrow that down. And I'll tell you, so I'll go back to what we were talking about in the beginning, and I know some people are joining us a little late here, but we said that there was somebody who was struggling to choose their market. This was on a recent Q&A that we did in our Empire Builders community, and she had taken the course maybe like
a month ago.
It ended a month ago, but she started taking the course maybe about 3 months ago, and she still hadn't chosen her market. Most people, when they take our course by week one, they have already chosen their market, but she had not chosen her market, and basically on the call she chose her market. And what happened was, she was saying that it wasn't her, but her husband really wanted to make sure that that it was within an hour flight from this their major airport, and it was a major hub in the country, so they really could have gone in a lot of different directions. And somebody in the community was like, hey, I also live in that same city and state, or close by to your city, and this is where we invest. It's just about an hour away by plane. And they started talking right there live, and she was sharing her successes in her market. She said, I got the team, I got everybody in place, it's going great. And that was it. That's what she needed. And it was so cool to see that just happening right there. And so just wanted to kind of, again, stress the importance of that community. All right. And we're going to close with this here, which is, we're talking about, all this talk about market choice, but at the end of the day, execution can trump market choice. What this essentially means, that you can make most markets work as long as you can execute really well. And what does good execution mean? Well, that means building a great team. We talked about the certain markets, there aren't many team members available, right? So that would make it hard to build a great team. So you want to think about that as you're choosing a market. But again, assuming you thought about that and you picked a market, you go out and build a great team. If you do that, that is like half the battle right there, if you can have a great team. The next one we talked about earlier was incorporating that design and features that will make your property stand out. Also choosing properties with hidden value and then tapping that hidden value to force appreciation. We talked about that earlier. Optimizing the guest experience. One thing about short-term rentals is that you're not providing housing anymore. With a long-term rental, you're just providing housing, right? But with a short-term rental, it's not about housing, it's about guest experience. It's a completely different thing. You're really in the hotel business now. You're not in the rental business. And so guest experience is absolutely essential. You want to make sure you get those 5-star reviews.
Yeah, and Superhost status. I mean, if you do any Airbnb searches, when somebody has a 5-star Superhost status and somebody has a 4.5, it's a very different kind of approach that you have to that property. And so this is extremely, extremely important, because making sure you have really great reviews is going to make you stand out, just as much as doing something like a really great design. It makes a huge difference.
And then studying competitors and understanding their keys to success. So this is also something that's really important, not just in the beginning, but on an ongoing basis. Is something that you want to be doing constantly, because your competitors are also doing this, right? They're one-upping each other, and so you want to make sure you don't fall behind. You want to see what they're doing.
And especially going into a recession, this is going to be really, really important. Recessions do tend to take out the weaker people who are the mom and pop landlords, and so making sure that you take this and treat this seriously as a business, and that you put some energy and time into making sure that you're constantly improving. We call it CANI, constant and never-ending improvement. It's really important to make yourself stand out long term, and be able to be around for the long term, rather than being one of the people that are weeded out very early with a recession. I'm gonna come back. I'm
Okay,
gonna
go
go check
ahead.
on
Yep.
baby. She's
Okay.
just crying so much. Excuse me.
All right. Okay, so I'm just putting in a couple. So Patricia, the one article is tax benefits of short-term rentals. And then the other article is how to buy a short-term rental with no money down. Those are the two articles. How to buy a short-term rental with no money down. Okay, so those are the two articles that we were mentioning earlier. All right, and then we're going to finish here. So just wanted to let you guys know, for those of you guys, I know you guys are on the wait list. The course launches April 24th. That's when the wait list sale starts. And if you are not in the pop-up Facebook group, please hop in there. And there's a lot of helpful, a lot of useful information in there. And then we'll also be announcing and letting you know when the sale starts. You'll be the first to know. And then we're going to have another webinar next week on April 20th at same time. And the title is How to Build Wealth with Short-Term Rentals During a Recession. And then, as I mentioned, the waitlist sale is April 24th to 26th. There's going to be a number of bonuses as well as a $200 discount. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop that and I will go to the Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to pop the questions into the Q&A. So Anonymous says, the investing landscape is very different from 2015 with much higher home prices and interest rates at 8 to 10%. Are you still finding cash flowing deals now in 2023? Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, our student who bought that property that we talked about with no money down and cash flowing really well is something that she bought last year. And so, yeah, our students are buying properties all the time and they're buying cash flowing deals. And that's the key, is that, you're not just going on, Redfin and just picking whatever looks good, right? You're really doing the analysis up front. You're really thinking through what makes a good short-term rental? How, is there hidden value? How do I force appreciation? If you're not unable to do this, then you're not going to be able to buy a cash flowing property. I mean, that's really why we spend so much effort teaching people how to do this. If anybody could do this, then we wouldn't need courses, you wouldn't need mentors, you wouldn't need coaches. Ultimately, there is a way to go out and buy these short-term rentals and cash flow, even in a market like this. And I would actually argue that if there's a significant recession coming, then there would be even greater opportunities. And so what you want to do is you want to position yourself to be in the right place, right? People call it lucky, but it's not lucky. It's what you're doing is you're preparing yourself to be in the right position so that when those deals come around, you're ready to go.
And you recognize them, right? Because if you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to know what a good deal is versus a not good deal. So you really need to be able to recognize when opportunities are in front of you. And if you don't know what an opportunity looks like, you're not going to recognize them. I do want to comment and say, of course, our market trends, there are going to be times that are a little bit more difficult to buy, and there are going to be times that are a little bit less difficult to buy. But real estate is also inefficient. There are lots of reasons people sell properties. And so there are always good deals to be had, no matter what is going on in the market. So if we were doing this webinar in 2001, you guys would be asking us the same question. You'd be saying it's too hot. The market's too hot. There aren't any good deals out there. Right now, we're talking about the interest rate and there not being any good deals. There are always deals. It doesn't matter what's going on. But, when we're asked, well, the interest rate's higher, should I lower my cash and cash calculations and accept a lower cash and cash return? We never say yes to that, because that cash and cash return is really your buffer. That's your way to get through unexpected expenses. It's also what's going to free you to work in your day job on your terms, because you'll have that reliable cash flow coming in every month. It is really important to have cash flow. So even when the market's hot or when the interest rate is high, we don't change our we don't lower our cash and cash criteria if we're not finding it, we wait until we find it, because we don't want to get ourselves in a situation that we buy a property that's actually a liability. A liability costs you money, you have to support it, versus an asset that makes you money long-term.
Oscar asks, how reliable is the information on AirDNA or Mashvisor to make accurate cash-on-cash calculations on a specific market? Yeah, that's what we were saying earlier, is the value of triangulation is that you're not relying just on the data point of AirDNA or Mashvisor, which may not be very accurate. And so,
And definitely in a rural area, it's even less accurate, right? Because they're relying on the data that's publicly available and available through, Airbnb and things like that. And if there's not that much data, then they're not going to have much to pull from. We can tell you when we were buying our short-term rental in a very rural area, it was way off, way off. And it also represents what's been going on in the market. It doesn't represent what's going to happen in the market in 6 months. That's your job as an investor, to be looking ahead and anticipating what's going to happen and planning for it now and saying, okay, I'm going to run the numbers, how it's been performing, let's say the last 3 months, because it's already a short-term rental. I'm going to run the numbers how I'm going to make it perform once I make all these changes and improve it. And now it's going to be performing at this other level. And then I'm also going to say, hey, I'm going to run it and say that the whole market drops 20%. What does that look like? Can I live with that? Are there things that I can do to make my property perform at even a higher level? So if it drops 20%, it's no big deal. Right. And that's your job as an investor. It's not just looking at the data as it was. It's getting data from multiple sources, so you actually have accurate data. I mean, if you're a doc and you draw a lab and it doesn't feel right to you, what do? You get another lab, right? It's when you get multiple sources of data that you start to really have accuracy. So when people come to us and they say, well, AirDNA says this, and we say, well, what did a property manager say? Oh, they said this. Well, what did another property manager say? What did your agent say? Did you look at Airbnb and look at neighboring properties and look at what they're doing, right? Like, there's so many different data sources, and the more data you have, the more accurate number you will have to put into your cash and cash calculations. And then you don't want your cash and cash calculator to be inaccurate, because that's garbage in, garbage out. You really need to be accurate. And so a lot of the times the answer is, when people say, I'm not sure about this number, the answer is go find more data sources to confirm or affirm that you are not, what you're feeling is actually true.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing, Oscar, is that you can make your property outperform everybody else, right? And so the information from AirDNA is just taking an average of what, let's say, the 3 bedrooms do, right? It's not really going to tell you, well, you can look at individual properties in there, but what you want to then do is you want to then study those properties and see what they're doing and see how they're far surpassing what the average performance is, and see, okay, can I match that with the property that I buy? I mean, you saw the property that's grossing $25,000 to $35,000 a month, and you saw how beautiful that property is. Well, clearly that property stands out way above everybody else. It's an outlier. There's no way that when they bought that property and they were looking at the data that it showed 25 to 35,000 a month. It did not show that, right? But what they were able to do is they were able to far surpass what everybody else was doing, just because their property stands out above the rest.
Yeah, and being an outlier takes energy and effort and thought. It really takes some thinking time to think about it. One of our mentors is Keith Cunningham, and he trained Robert Kiyosaki. And he used to own car washes, and I'm in a mastermind with him. And somebody asked him in one of my masterminds, like, how did you figure out what your car washes were going to make? Like, when you were buying them, did you just compare it to other car washes? And he said, no, my car wash was 5x over what everyone else was making. I had nobody else to compare to except myself. And so every year I would compare to myself and I would push myself to get better. right? And that's how he could compare, because he was so head and shoulders above everyone else because he was thinking like a business person. And what he was thinking all the time is, how do I increase income and how do I decrease expenses? And he made innovation after innovation. He decided that being in the car wash business was not about clean cars. It was about empowerment and feeling good about yourself. And so when people would come to the car wash, he had a free shoe shine person there giving free shoe shines, because that was going to make people feel good about themselves and feel empowered. And so he did things that nobody else even thought of doing, because he was always thinking about increasing income and decreasing expenses and thinking differently. And so you do really have that opportunity to look at the average, of course, but to make yourself stand out and be way above average if you want to.
All right, Omar asks, how do you navigate obtaining a mortgage loan as a first-time real estate investor? It's really not challenging. We can refer you to ours, but there's no reason why, as a first-time real estate investor, you couldn't get a loan as long as you meet the income requirements, as long as you have relatively good credit. There should be no reason. It's not. When you're getting a residential loan, it's not like you have to have prior experience before getting a mortgage. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but as a first-time investor, it's actually probably easier for you to get a loan than somebody who might have like 5 loans, just because your debt-to-income ratio is going to be better than the person who's got 5 loans out there. So I'm going to drop in let me see here. So, yeah.
The other thing I want to say is investor lenders are really friendly in terms of trying to help it work for you. And so we've closed on multiple properties in the same week, like do things that you never maybe thought were possible in terms of actually obtaining a lot of loans. And when we first started, we said, well, we're going to actually get our loans in each other's individual names, not together, because limited together, we were limited to 10 loans before the interest rate would go up. And so we thought, well, we're going to have more than 10 loans. And we actually did get more than 10 loans. So I know you're thinking about your first loan, but I'm telling you that as a real estate investor, once you start to get going, once you start to make cash flow, that cash flow is coming in, you're going to be thinking about your next property and your next property. And it's not going to be too long until you have 4 or 5 properties. It's just the way we all work. And that feeds into the next question.
Okay. So if you have Zoma asks, I say I have 200,000 to invest. Do you recommend using that amount to buy property, one property, or split it into 2 to 3 down payments for different properties? And yeah, this is a personal decision. The question is, whether you use debt or leverage, how leveraged you want to be. I think at the end of the day, if you use leverage, and if you're able to use leverage, some people don't for religious reasons, but if you're able to use leverage, then you're going to be able to grow that much faster, because you're going to be able to buy more properties. You're going to have more resources to renovate, for example. And so, yeah, the more you borrow, the more leverage you are, the more you can buy. However, the downside of that is that you are leveraged, and that's why the cash flow is so important. Is because as long as you're cash flowing really well, then that means that you're covering the debt and you still have money left over, right? And so it's less likely that you're going to get into trouble as long as you're cash flowing well. And that's why we keep saying you got to cash flow really well in your properties.
Yeah, I think if the question is, should you buy one big property or should you split it into 2 to 3 smaller properties, there are upsides and downsides. The things I think about if you have only one big property is that concentration risk. You have a lot of risk just tied up in one property versus having 2 to 3 properties. But it's much easier to buy one property instead of buying 2 or 3 properties, right? That there's some efficiencies in one property versus multiple properties. But one of the upsides of having 2 to 3 properties for the same amount of money as you would buy with one property is you actually can get potentially higher tax breaks, because depreciation is often higher for if you, in the same amount of money, have multiple doors and multiple kitchens and all those pieces. So your depreciation tends to be a little bit higher. So that's another thing to think about. And then lastly, I just wanted to comment that when I think about it, having 200,000, I would rather put like 100,000 into the property as a down payment and 100,000 into the rehab than go and buy a property with 200,000 down, because that rehab is the forced depreciation. And with 100,000 into a property to fix it up, oftentimes you're ending up making 200,000 on top of that, right? And so it can be quite substantial, the amount that you can force appreciation if you make smart upgrades. And that's what really grows your wealth very rapidly. So I would, in any property, I would rather buy a property that needs work and buy a property that I'm going to increase that value and use some of my money for improving the property rather than putting all of it into the down payment.
Anonymous asks, what platforms and automations do you recommend using when self-managing a short-term rental, when not getting a property manager? I'm going to drop in some resources that we use. I think at a foundation for us is OwnerRez. That's the software that we use, so that is what allows us to manage all the different platforms like Airbnb and VRBO. And then in terms of other things, Price Labs is something that we use for pricing, dynamic pricing. There's a link to that in that directory as well. And then we have tools like NoiseAware for party prevention. And then we also have things like the Schlage lock for changing the door code. So
Yeah,
some examples of
Kenji
things
could
that-
go on and on and
Yeah.
on. And this is what's included in all of our short-term rental course, Accelerating Wealth. We have a whole section on this because, yeah, there's a lot of technology that you can use to automate. And that's a really important thing. Automation is what allows you to really be freed up to do the highest and best use of your time, which is going to find another property or going to get the down payment for the next property or making those relationships. Those are the three things that you should be working on that are your highest and best use. Go ahead.
There you go, and I'll just finish.
No, she's okay. I think
Okay,
she's sleeping.
cool. All right,
Yeah,
great.
it sounds like she's
All right.
sleeping.
And then how much do you typically put down for your investment properties? Yeah, so I mean, we're in a position where we generally put down the standard, which is 25% for all of our investment properties, but people in our community are looking for ways to put down less so that they can they can, like, just like we said, they can actually buy more properties, have money for renovations and things like that. With short-term rentals, you can put down 10% and sometimes even less, depending on where you get your loan. But if you use the vendor that we just recommended there, they have second home loans for 10% down, sometimes 15% down if it's jumbo. There are even stories of people who do some house hacking where they, like, let's say they have a mother-in-law above a garage and they live there, and then they rent out the main house as a short-term rental. But because they bought it and they owner occupied it, they actually bought the property with 0% down. So there are situations where you can do something like that.
And I can't tell you how many of our students have gone on to put ADUs on their personal residences. It's definitely something very commonly done in our community.
Daniel, how do you locate, screen, keep cleaners and handymen in areas away from where you live? Yeah, so this gets into remote investing and some of the fears of investing long distance. But yeah, I mean, I self-manage our Dallas property, and I found a cleaner through a referral. So referral from our community. We have a large community, and it's very easy to find people through referral. But even if I didn't have that resource, then I would just screen them, or call them, screen them, and do it all remotely. And yes, I absolutely have backups if they fail.
Backups to backups.
Backups to backups. Yeah, you want to have backups to backups for cleaners and handymen for sure. But yeah, it's, once you kind of get started and you have somebody in place, it's really not that hard to, interview them, screen them, and then manage them long distance. Okay, boy. When thinking about having a good backup plan and maximizing tax benefits from short-term rental using bonus depreciation and other strategies, do you see that influencing where or how far folks are investing? Yeah, that's what we were saying earlier, which is that, you don't want to have that be your primary driver.
The taxes.
Yeah, the taxes. You don't want to have the maximizing the tax benefits. What I would say is you want to maximize cash flow and forced depreciation first. And even if you don't maximize tax benefits, like I'll take that all day over poor cash flow, little forced depreciation, and top, the insane tax benefits, right? I will take the cash flow and forced depreciation and very few tax benefits over insane tax benefits and very little cash flow and forced depreciation.
I also want to clarify that we have a lot of people claiming the short-term rental tax loophole with 100 hours and more than anyone else on that property in the calendar year remotely. They're going to do all the work of doing due diligence and closing on the property, which takes some period of time, finding their cleaners, finding their handyman. They're going to fly out often and set up the property, and then they're going to self-manage. So they easily do 100 hours and more than anyone else in those types of cases. And so even with a remote short-term rental, they're still getting all the tax benefits of sheltering their W-2 income from the depreciation with those properties. And so it's not a matter of how far it is. You can totally do it with a remote short-term rental. You just have to decide you want to do it.
All right, Chi-Chi, hey Chi-Chi, what is the meaning of cap rate? How helpful is that information? Yeah, we focus on one of the values, one of the things that we do is we really try to simplify things, and there are a lot of different metrics out there. But what we've just, after kind of studying all the different metrics and using them for many, many years, I've been investing in real estate for now since 2001, so that's like 22 years. Ultimately, we found that the best metric for assessing these types of properties is cash flow, right? And that's why cash on cash return is what we focus on. We do use cap rate, but for a very specific reason, for a different purpose. But if you want to know the definition of cap rate, it's the NOI, the net operating income divided by the property value. And so it's helpful for...
It's not really helpful for short-term rentals, honestly.
Yeah, it's really not helpful for short-term rentals at all. Yeah, exactly.
It's more helpful for long-term rentals and really large multifamily rentals.
Maybe. Yeah.
More helpful than, but I wouldn't even think about it with a short-term rental. It's completely unhelpful.
Yeah. So if you just focus on cash return and really get good at that and understand that metric really well, then you can use that metric,
unless you go
build your empire,
unless you go out and buy like a 40 unit that you're going to make into all short-term rentals, and then your real estate agent will probably talk about cap rate, and then it's probably something good.
And then you're going to say, what's the cash flow?
What's the well, no, you're
cash on cash return.
You're not going to ask your real estate agent. You're going to figure it out yourself.
That's right. You're going to calculate it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to rely on other people for your metrics.
Right. Okay, Julia, is it easier to get a mortgage for a short-term rental as an investment property or as a second home, or the interest rates better for a second home? Easier. I mean, so for second home loan, you can put down 10%. If you're buying it as an investment property, not a second home, then it's 25% down.
But the second home loan has a lot of regulations in terms of where the location is and how often you have to use it that first 12 months versus how often it can be rented the first 12 months. So there's all those regulations, kind of rules in place. So it's probably not different in terms of easiness to get the mortgage, but once you have the mortgage, I would say it's a little bit more cumbersome. The rules of the second home loan are more cumbersome than an investment property rules.
I would say it's probably just as easy to get a mortgage for an investment loan versus a second home loan. And now, is the interest rates better for a second home loan? Probably similar, actually,
but PMI, you might have to buy points and stuff because it's 10% down.
Home. No, not for second home. Yeah. So, so I don't think that the interest rates are that different, but that's why we have but you're welcome to call our trusted vendor there. That's our investor friendly lender, and they can give you that answer, and they serve our community. So that they even if you don't work with them, they're happy to answer your questions. I would ask them. Okay, Rim, do you buy a short-term rental under your name or under an LLC name? It kind of depends. Depends on your loan. Some people are buying these properties with DSCR loan, debt service coverage ratio loans. In those, you can actually buy in the LLC name. But if you're using a residential investment loan or a second home loan, then you're going to have to buy it. You're going to have to buy it in your name. You can't buy it in an LLC name. And then you later on, you would then transfer the deed into an LLC after you buy it.
Yep. And that's what we've always done.
Okay, Van, how do you find contractors for major renovation, forced depreciation if you live thousands of miles away from the property? You pick up the phone and you call and you talk to them and you interview them and then
And oftentimes they come from other members of your team.
Right.
Good people tend to know good people. And
Mhm.
so I would say often they'll come from your agent or your property manager or other investors in the market. And yeah, you'll interview them and you may test them out on a small project and see how they perform. I know we just had a contractor go into our Dallas short-term rental, right? And then we had the cleaner, after he did his work, take some pictures of it, and then it was subpar work, right? So we had to go hire somebody to go do it again.
Yeah,
So
I just fixed a major gas leak, and
it was $12,000 project.
yeah, it was not, it was calling the gas company, turning off the gas, and then calling a plumber, having them try to find the gas leak. They couldn't find it. They were going to tear up all the walls, and they basically just, and then we had to make a decision to basically reroute the pipes outside the home. But that was all, but then they had to dig a trench. Anyway, you get the idea. I managed that whole thing from Puerto Rico, and this house is in Dallas. So it was it really wasn't a big problem. I think, like we're in the age of telemedicine, right? You can do a lot remotely, and I think it's one of these things. Once you do it, of course, totally understandable that it would be scary and that you would have maybe some fears about it or doubts about it. But once you do it, then you realize it's not that big of a deal. Okay, Miriam, how long after buying the property can you take the equity out to buy another one? Yeah, so there are new rules around cash out refis where it's 12 months. So it's called seasoning period. You have to let the property season for 12 months. You have to let it kind of sit for 12 months before you can take that money out. But that's not all loans. That's residential loans that are backed by Fannie and Freddie. There are other loans that you can get where the seasoning period is shorter. And you can even do things like hard money loans, because they're short-term loans, and then get that final loan after you get that short-term, after you use that short-term loan. Then there is no seasoning period for hard money loans. And so you can immediately refinance after you finish your renovation and you force appreciation. Okay. What do you think about owner financing? I think we're going to do this. Let's just do this last question, and then should be Siva's last question. Owner financing, seller financing, that's when the seller becomes the bank. Yeah, I think it's a really good option in this day and age. We're looking to sell a property right now, and that's something that we're offering as well. For part of it is we're offering some part of it as seller financing. So yeah, I think it's a great way to get a lower interest rate in this higher interest rate environment. Okay, and then Shibi, I already paid off my home and currently it's rented as I moved out of the area. Should I apply for a HELOC on this 1031 home or get a separate mortgage, please? Well, gosh, that's a very involved question. I would need to see the numbers and the data to really know what would be the best option. There's probably some personal factors in there as well.
But ultimately, I mean, you can get the numbers for both and you can kind of
Compare.
see which one's best.
Yeah.
I mean, and I suspect it'll be pretty clear which one's going to have the best return for you.
Yeah, and the 1031 also depends on your replacement property. What are you buying in its place, right? And what do the numbers look on that replacement property? So you got to kind of think about that step. And also you got to realize with a 1031 exchange, there's a very narrow window of time before you have to identify the replacement property. And so if you're not in a position where you're getting a lot of good deals on a regular basis, like you have to put yourself in that position before you do a 1031, where you're getting a lot of good deal flow so that you have a lot of options. Like you don't want to just have to buy whatever you can find. Again, the more experienced you are, the more options you're going to have in terms of a replacement property, the better the deal that you're going to be able to buy if you are more experienced.
Yeah, I think we got to most of the questions. For the questions we didn't get to, you guys feel free to throw them into semi-retired physicians or semi-retired professionals. And
What about the pop-up Facebook?
yeah, but we're not in there answering questions all
Okay.
the time
Yeah,
either.
okay. Well, they can tag us, I guess. Well, anyway, you can either, you can also tag us and in any of those groups and just say, hey, I was at the Q&A and, you didn't get to my question, or I had other follow-up questions. I know there are going to be people watching this on video afterwards. So if you have questions, you can also pop your question into those groups and tag us.
Mhm.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for joining
Night.
us. Okay. We'll see you next week.